Thank you. Mr. Kumar Gupta, Professor Shaibu Gupta, sorry, so I say, Professor Shaibu Gupta, Professor Gautam. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And on behalf of the Tata-Cornell Institute, let me also welcome you all to this gathering. It's great to see such a large group of people here to talk about food systems and diversification of food systems. Let me say that the Tata-Cornell Institute has been thinking about issues of agriculture and nutrition and its connection to food systems. And we've been looking at how food systems diversification is a crucial part of the strategy that India needs to pursue as you look at addressing the problem of malnutrition in the country, addressing the problem of stunting, especially childhood stunting, and also addressing the need for meeting the demands for diversity as incomes rise, as middle-class populations grow, and as middle-class populations' diet keeps changing. So these are some of the big challenges that we're looking at, and we're looking at opportunities for addressing these through changes in the food system. Why is this such an important issue? Why should we be thinking about a food systems perspective? Well, let's look at the basics. For the past 50 years, India has focused on addressing hunger, which was the right thing to do. India was focused on reducing hunger by looking at increasing the production of rice and increasing the production of wheat. And by all accounts, we should be congratulating ourselves for having done such a tremendous job in absolutely increasing overall productivity of these crops across the country. Of course, there's differences by region, but India as a country has become self-sufficient in food grains primarily because of the enormous investments in research and enormous policy emphasis that was put together for these two primary statements. So that was the good news. The great news, in fact, in being able to address the chronic hunger problem. Of course, there's still hungry people in India, but hunger is no longer an issue of not having enough quantity of food in the country. It's become much more an issue of access to food. So that's an issue that we need to be looking at much more carefully in terms of how do you improve access to better food for the poor. Now, the question that we have is, we've addressed the calorie needs of the population through improved supplies and reduced prices of rice and wheat, but we've not addressed the overall nutritional needs of the populations. So we've seen that the extent to which pulses and legumes and vegetables and fruit and livestock products are produced has not been commensurate with the overall demand for these products. And that's been a big challenge. So even in places like Bihar and UP, you've seen that prior to the Green Revolution, you had a very diversified production system. A production system that included pulses and legumes and millets, etc. Now, through the Green Revolution, much of this diversity got crowded out. Much of the production systems in the Indo-Gangetic Plain became a rice-wheat production system, and pulses moved out of the system. Coarse cereals moved out of the system. So you went from a very diversified, low-yield, diversified production system to a high-yielding, very specialized production system. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge because, one, the price of the non-staple crops, the price of legumes, vegetables, pulses, etc., have shot up relative to the staples. and the access to these commodities has become much more difficult. So the very poor populations found that their diets had not been able to diversify in order to meet the needs of micronutrients, vitamins, protein, etc. And as a result, for the very poor populations, you begin to see high levels of stunting, high levels of wasting. And even the latest NFHS survey shows you those results very, very clearly. We've not been able to make as much progress in reducing the chronic malnutrition indicators as we should have been in this country. So that's one of the challenges that the diversified food system can meet. The other is that as middle class incomes are rising, as I mentioned earlier, the need for diversity in the food system is rising. But middle class diets are also not keeping up to the extent of increasing their diversity, to the extent of enhancing micronutrient and vitamin intake in their diets. And that's primarily because the overall supply of diversity has been limited and the relative price of diversity has been very high. And so you see middle class populations tripping into processed food as a way in which you can create that diversity. So middle class populations are moving from a very stable grain-oriented diet to an increasingly processed food-oriented diet, which has its own health consequences associated with it. So when you think about it, whether you're addressing the problems of nutrition of the very poor or the problems of nutrition of the middle class and the richer populations, the solution is the same. The solution is improved diversity of the food system in order to bring about increased access to a diverse set of food commodities and also to reduce the overall prices of the non-staples. So that's where the challenge that we have in the food system is today. Now, it's easy to say that. So why is it that you don't see farmers responding by changing the supply system and increasing diversity? As an economist, I would say if prices are high, then farmers would be responding by increasing supply of those commodities for which prices are high. So why is that not happening? That's been an issue that many of us have been thinking about for a while now. So I can give you several reasons why I think that's the case. I think one of the first and most fundamental reason is that agriculture policy is very much biased towards the big states. And agriculture policy does not adequately promote the non-staple production systems. So if you think about price support policies, if you think about investments in irrigation, infrastructure, etc., if you think about input subsidy policies, if you think about extension services and research systems, all of this is targeting increased production of rice and wheat. I'm not saying one should not be looking at rice and wheat, but looking beyond rice and wheat is an important criteria. And looking at ways in which policies can be designed in order to reduce that bias that you have today in just focusing on those two commodities is a fundamental necessity that we have. And the main reason that we see a lack of interest in diversification is the policy focus that we have. So that's a change. That's a change that we should be looking at. And I hope today in our discussions we'll be talking a lot more about that. The second, I think, is around infrastructure investments. I think we've done an enormously great job in setting up infrastructure that allows us to procure staples, even from very remote areas. So staple grain procurement has a system that's established. And that system is based on the infrastructure, the market infrastructure, etc., for allowing that procurement to take place. We don't have a similar system when you think about vegetables, or when you think about fruit, or when you think about livestock products. The market infrastructure around that is very limited. So even today, smallholders producing vegetables can only sit by the roadside and sell their vegetables. You don't have a formal market system in rural areas, in villages, in district towns, and in more urban areas, where farmers can come in with their produce and be able to sell it into a more organized market infrastructure, which allows them the incentives to bring that produce into the system. And for procurement agents, private procurement agents, etc., to be able to get that procurement from those organized systems. So the market infrastructure around non-staples is very poor. Simple things like clean sheds for where selling takes place, cold storage systems, transport of perishable products in a way that spoilage is minimized, etc. These are some of the infrastructure investments that are crucially needed. And today, the extent of investments in those areas is extremely small. I think there's a third reason why farmers are reluctant to move out of rice and wheat. And the third reason is that the knowledge required, the skill required, is significantly higher. Because when you're trying to grow vegetables or fruit, you're not just looking at producing quantity, you're looking at quality, you're looking at what's the best time to harvest, what's the best time to get it into the market, what's the best price to sell it at, etc. These are very complex decisions. And given the complexity of the production, processing, marketing decision, farmers tend to be a little hesitant to get into this, especially if prices are extremely variable, and especially if it's not clear whether you're going to get the returns to your investments. And one of the things governments could do better is to look at extension services that can help farmers through improving their skills and knowledge in producing these crops. The extension services around rice and wheat have been strong for decades. But the extension services beyond these crops has been very poor. And I think that's where one can look at opportunities. And one can look at opportunities not just from the public sector, but also the private sector. And opportunities for public-private partnerships in these extension areas. Then the fourth area, I think, is around the transactions cost, the costs farmers face in going to the market and being able to sell their produce. As we all know, most farmers in India are very small farmers with 1 acre, less than 1 acre of land. That's particularly true in Bihar. And for small farmers to be able to take vegetables, fruit, etc. into the market is a very high-cost activity. It's high cost not just in transport, but it's high cost in terms of the bargaining that's needed, in terms of meeting the quality standards, meeting the safety standards, etc. And our ability to reduce those transactions costs is a big part of what's needed in order for farmers to be able to participate in these markets. And we need to look at ways in which we can do this. There are all sorts of experiments going on creating producer organizations, creating cooperatives, etc., that help farmers to reduce the cost of meeting the needs of the market and being able to sell it to the market. We need ways in which we can make that an easier process, promote more effective models, etc. One of the things that I notice in Bihar is the extent to which self-help groups have been moving across the state. Bihar has become a major leader in the women's self-help group movement. Now, is that a platform that you can use for also promoting livestock production, vegetable production, fruit production, etc. Can these women's self-help groups be converted into producer organizations? Is that an opportunity? Is it something we can think about? So these are some of the big challenges that we are facing. We can talk about moving away from staples, but in order to be able to move away from staples, one needs very concerted efforts similar to the efforts that were made in India in the late 60s and in the 70s, when India made its big jump from being food deficit to a food self-sufficient country. I think today we need a similar scale of effort to move India from a country that's sufficient in staples but not in the non-staples, to look at a country that becomes overall sufficient in a diversified and a more nutritious food system. I look forward to the discussion today, and I hope we'll get some good ideas on moving forward. Thank you very much.